So this is the overview. We're going to talk about the origins of our project, our teacher, Thomas Berry, Pope Francis's encyclical, Laudato Si, indigenous traditions and ecology, and we'll end briefly with our Journey of the Universe multimedia project. So we recognize, as many of you do, of course, that there's problems and promise with religion, but 85% of the world's people identify as religious. And so science, policy, law, economics, technology are necessary but not sufficient. And our Yale dean, Gus Speth, who's internationally known, brought us to Yale because he felt there's a need for a larger spiritual force and ethical force. And as a student in Washington, D.C. during college, I was deeply affected by the social justice and civil rights movement, where here in the U.S., separate but equal was morally acceptable until religious leaders and laity raised their voices to say no.
And we have had the occasion in developing our careers as historians of religion to explore ethical perspectives from many different traditions. And our teacher, Thomas Berry, had raised this question for us early on in our exchange with him in the 1970s. He said, we have ethics for homicide and suicide and even genocide, but not for biocide or ecocide. So Thomas Berry was perceptive in this regard. And as I developed my own career in the study with Native American peoples, these indigenous peoples on the Northern Plains, I found my way to this couple, Adam Burdenground and Violet Medicine Horse. And Adam and Violet brought Mary Evelyn into their family so that my studies began to take on more than simply the distance of a scientific or social science perspective, but that intimacy of the humanities. So I wanted to open with Adam and Violet to suggest that my studies have focused very extensively on symbolic understandings among indigenous people. Adam and Violet here are pictured in ceremonial garb of the Native American Church. And in this context, I also studied ritual activity on the Northern Plains with Anishinaabe people in the Great Lakes region, actually the Crow people or Apsaloke peoples on the Northern Plains, and in the Columbia River region. So this focus on ceremonial life, I wanted to include this picture of a Sundance ceremonial to show the cooking, the feasting. Alongside of the symbolic and ritual life is all of this life way, a sense of the symbolic life folded into the nurturing and the ways of life of the people as they build a ceremonial lodge. This is what the Crow call an ashkese, or the big lodge, the cosmic lodge. They are literally making a structure that the dancers will go into for 3, 4, or 5 days, and they'll go without food and water and undertake this rigorous ordeal in order to contact the powers that they see in the larger cosmos. You'll notice the buffalo on the central tree, willow branches for water, symbolizing water. There is an eagle, also a stuffed eagle in the upper branches. So this ceremonial life was a large part of my focus, especially the stories or the cosmological understandings that Native people have of themselves. But it was in this context also that I realized, as much as the symbolic life, the ritual life, it's the justice issues. And Native people made me very aware that their outreach to the United Nations, especially even before that, the League of Nations, their effort to find their own voice again, to assert their sovereignty, led in 2007 to UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So these issues have come forward in my studies, from cosmological stories and symbolic understandings to the quest for people to understand their, to help people understand their position, their sovereignty, their voice in the contemporary scene.
And my own efforts in this area began when I went to Japan to teach at a women's college in 73, 74. And we could see the effects of pollution in Japan. Here's Mount Fuji, but the overseas development created a lot of pollution across Asia from the Japanese and others. In China, I went there first in 85 when these areas were pure, the water, the air. This is Guilin in the south. But as you know well, China and India are some of the most polluted countries in the world, the water, the air, the soil. And so I began to study in the early 70s the traditions of Japan, and many of us in Asian studies were anticipating what would happen as India and China began to develop. So here's a Buddhist garden in Kyoto and the beauty and harmony of nature. Here is a school, a Confucian school near where I taught, and Confucianism is an enormously influential tradition across East Asia, where the idea of cultivation of the self for the larger good of the society is encouraged. And you know, East Asian students are tremendous students all across the world because of Confucianism. This is a torii, or a gateway near Hiroshima, which is Shinto-based, and it's a marker between the secular and the sacred world, where the sense of the livingness of the sacredness of nature you see here at the bottom. Buddhism then has interdependence, with a sense that humans are not alone, but are deeply embedded in nature's systems. Confucianism has this tremendous idea of qi. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Tai Chi or Qigong or the traditional Chinese medicines, all of which are to facilitate the flourishing of human qi in relation to nature's qi, which is in everything: plants, animals, birds, fish, ecosystems, water, mountains, and so on. And it means matter, energy, a non-dualistic understanding of the vital forces in the universe. So the origins then of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, because of the importance of Asia, almost 2/3 of the world people live there, China and India changing the face of the planet rapidly with their industrialization and their ecological destruction, of which they're fully aware. But the notion that we need culturally grounded environmental ethics, they're not going to be Western-centered environmental ethics. And the nature-based religions out of Asia are tremendous examples of how humans are embedded into these dynamic ecosystems. So here's a quote that also suggests, beyond just religion as institution, Ronald Dworkin, a law professor at NYU, says, "A religious attitude involves moral and cosmic convictions beyond simply belief in God, that people have an innate, inescapable responsibility to make something valuable of their lives, and the natural world is gloriously, mysteriously wonderful." I just want to mention that traditions like Unitarianism, of which some of you are participating, have this sensibility very richly. And so there's a sensibility beyond, way beyond God talk in some of the religions, but also in nature-based understandings around the world, and nature writers as well. So wanted to open up that door to spiritual, not religious people and ideas.
We undertook a series of conferences at the Harvard Center for the Study of World Religions in the mid-1990s, and this brought us to the possibility of gathering scholars, environmentalists who were focused on a particular religious tradition, and scientists also in particularly focused conversations with regard to indigenous traditions, as you can see here, Judaism, Christianity, the Western Abrahamic traditions, South Asian traditions, and East Asian traditions. These volumes then that resulted from these conferences were one of the earliest efforts to really focus particular ideas, concepts, and commentarial traditions in their reflections on human-earth relations. So from this conference series, the project on religion and ecology really sprang forward our work in the mid-90s. We had also had, for some decade before that, an ecology and justice series with Orbis books. And you can see in the central book, Leonardo Boff, a Brazilian liberation theologian who was very influential on Pope Francis's framing of the encyclical Laudato Si. So this series is focused on water issues, and see the range of discussions that we've undertaken here, and the sense of feminist issues also. Our effort then in this forum on religion and ecology, which we brought in 2006 to Yale, was to develop initially a website. And so the website at 4 here, the Forum on Religion and Ecology, is focused on the academic field. And this field then is an effort to draw forward to retrieve, if you will, the ideas, concepts, the ritual practices within these different religious traditions, to bring them forward, to evaluate, do they say something to us today? And within the traditions then, is it possible to reconstruct some of these ideas so that they meet our contemporary needs? So on this website, you can find statements from religious leaders, scriptural references, bibliographies that are annotated. And now we're pleased to say that not only 15, there are 17 programs on religion and ecology in academic settings in the United States. So along with the field, this program on religion and ecology has attempted to bring forward the force or the engaged projects on the ground, religious environmentalism. So on the website, you can find an eco-justice hub, which is one dimension of this sense of the force of religion and ecology. Eco-justice, an effort to bring forth the voice of people in their relationships with local bioregions. Along with the website, there are online classes on the Yale Coursera website. So this sense of the academic field and the force for change in society is an effort to foreground the protection that religions are able to bring their voice for the protection of the sacred earth community, a concept earth community that Thomas Berry developed in his thinking, which we'll talk of more in a bit. This sense of resistance to exploitative projects that bring forward the eco-justice concept. How are they diminishing people's understanding and relationships to their local bioregions? And finally, and perhaps one of the most seminal ideas in the Religion and Ecology Project, is the sense of building endurance and resilience within those who are working in these areas with eco-spiritualities. Our teacher, Thomas Berry, whose dates here you see to 2009, was a treasured voice and a very formative voice for us. You can see some of his publications here, The Dream of the Earth, which is his effort to explore how the human dream is really situated in the larger dream of the earth. So everything in Thomas Berry, everything in the human community is a subsection of the earth community. We need to see ourselves as situated within this larger realm. In the lower section, the corner, then the great work, his attention to the force or engagement that every society, as he sees it in religious communities, they're called to their own great work. And our effort, as he would see it, is the sacred universe, this book published in the upper corner. And his final works, then, Evening Thoughts, where at every stage of life, he saw that there was a need for reflection on these issues.
And it's his birthday today, so we're celebrating that across the country and around the world, actually, with an evening program tonight.
And his understanding then of eco-spirituality has been a shaping and very hopeful vision for us. He would say, at its core, even our human spirituality is earth-derived. The human and the earth are totally implicated, each in the other. If there is no spirituality in the earth, then there's no spirituality in ourselves. So Thomas Berry had this insight into the spiritual presence in all of life, in all of the material realm also. He would say we can no longer hear the voice of the rivers, the mountains, or the sea. The trees and the meadows are no longer intimate modes of spirit presence. The world about us has become an it rather than a thou. So his understanding of how this distancing happened, the human and the earth, he was calling for a deeper reciprocity. It's in this renewed sense of reciprocity with nature, in all of its complexity and remarkable beauty, that could help provide the psychic and spiritual energies necessary for the work ahead. Some of the key ideas that Thomas Berry put forward then, is underlined here, is that We dwell in a sacred universe, really a powerful understanding that he had that the world around us is speaking to us. It's an earth community that brings us into our most immediate contact with the larger universe. And this earth community then is not simply a collection of objects, but the universe, the earth, is a communion of subject's voice. His call then for a great work to create a flourishing future, not simply for the human, but for the earth community.
Now, we'd like to just give an example of one of the key happenings in our world today. And as we say, there's problems and promise, and we're referring now to the Catholic Church, and France certainly has an understanding of the problems of Catholicism and of all the world's religions that we share. But we have a Pope who happens to be authentic, actually lovable and believable. And he, in 2015, released an encyclical, a letter on the environment called Laudato Si, which means praise be, care for our common home. And this phrase that John referred to from the Leonardo Boff, the liberation theologian, cry of the earth, cry of the poor, is putting together this sense that the earth is suffering, as are the poor, the vulnerable, all over the earth. We know that's true for climate change and for all the issues of flood and hurricanes and so on, that the vulnerable, the dispossessed are suffering. And in this country, that's very, very clear. African-American communities, Latino communities, and so on. And that's the point of eco-justice. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the chapters in this encyclical. So there was a broad invitation from the very beginning to Catholics around the world, but also Christians. The Orthodox Church has been working on these issues with the Greek Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew, so has Protestant groups. And then he extended it to people of all religions, spiritual people, seekers. This is the first time an encyclical is addressed to the whole world. Now, the response of the world's religions was astonishing, positive and affirming. They've written their own statements, but in particular in response to this encyclical, they want to work with this Laudato Si movement. And there's a new film that was just released called The Letter on the Feast of St. Francis, which in a month's time had 8 million people watch. So the influence is significant. The response of environmentalists also has been astonishing. Scientists and ecologists, many of whom we know, including Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org, a climate movement, he said when he came to Yale, this is the most important document of the 21st century. And it begins with the science, which is so significant. Then it goes to the second chapter, which is more eco-spirituality, the gospel of creation. And he's speaking about the mystery of the universe, awe, wonder, beauty, and the interdependence of all life. Then he goes to the human roots of the ecological crisis, and he is absolutely keen on saying the instrumental use of nature just for humans is problematic. Consumerism and materialism, especially in the US, is horrendous. And market-based solutions are not sufficient. They may be necessary. They're going to be at COP, and they're at our School of the Environment, but necessary but not sufficient. So then he goes to what's called integral ecology, which puts this eco-justice together, people and planet. So he says ecology, economics, equity, and ethics are integrated for action. So the awe and the action, these are the pulsating dimensions of the encyclical, and tremendous solidarity with the poor, with refugees, and definitely with youth. So climate action in religious communities have been growing over the last 10 years. Communities measuring their carbon footprint, going towards alternative and renewable energies, divestment from fossil fuels, and restoration projects. But I want to say in the divestment movement, $40 trillion has been part of that movement now in a period of just a dozen years. And a third of that is from religious communities who don't want their pension funds and so on invested in fossil fuels. So the restoration projects are part of these engaged projects all over the world, forests, reforestation, river cleanup, cities, and so on. And religious communities are doing this on the ground, the local. So this was evident fully at the Glasgow conference last November, and it's evident already in the beginnings of the conference in Egypt, namely that the faith communities are very much present in these last two conferences, youth are very much present, and as well indigenous peoples. These are the three groups on the outer rims of the conference that are extraordinarily active now.
We could have chosen, for examples, as Mary Evelyn focused on Laudato Si in the Christian or Abrahamic traditions, we could have carried this also into eco-villages in South Asia among Hinduism in the communities, as well as religious environmentalism in the East Asian setting. But because of time constraints, let's take up the question of indigenous peoples and what they bring to these issues. And all of us are aware that among the 500 to 700 million, however the count is made, the indigenous presence on this planet has been a tremendous source of resilience. People who've been marginalized and moved into marginalized regions. We now know that the hot zones or where biodiversity is most prominent is the same region that we find indigenous peoples located. The reason we begin to understand is that they have maintained their own understandings of this sacred universe, a meaningful universe, a giving universe. And they use various names, but often Mother Earth surfaces in many of these traditions. But most importantly, respect and reverence for the earth as it gives and as it speaks to us. So this idea of earth community that Thomas Berry spoke of is draws out also the ideas of kinship that indigenous peoples have in their own languages, that the relatedness to life, in fact, relational thought or that type of worldview is embedded in their sense of the communion of subjects, that there's a differentiated sentience among animals, fish, birds, trees. The plant world is able to speak to peoples and to communicate how the benefits and how use is in their own perspective in relationship to human societies. And we have this idea of the great work in indigenous traditions of rekindling this relationality.
I just want to add to John's point about differentiated sentience. Just one example, the communication among trees and tree roots now is widely understood in the science world, as well as animal behavior world from science and so on, the communication of dolphins and whales and so on, migrating patterns. So this is a scientific as well as traditional environmental knowledge, understanding of a certain type of sentience in the world around us.
One example that's very clear of this voice is the Potawatomi botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer and her work on braiding sweetgrass, powerful understanding of this relational worldview and how her community developed an understanding of kinship, of respect, and of reverence with the world and the approach to the world. So this sense of eco-spirituality and eco-justice that we find in Robin's work and other indigenous scholars and writers of the weave, or this sense of the integral relationship in traditional environmental knowledge and indigenous knowledge, that these are ways of relating now with scientific knowledge, and that braid or the interrelationship is understood as ways of knowing. And we have multiple ways of knowing now as action that inspires our protection of nature. One striking example that came forth in 2016 was the effort of the Hunkpapa, a Lakota people in the middle of the North American continent in the state of now North Dakota, who realized that a pipeline that was being built underneath the Missouri River would endanger their water supply and, most importantly, the water itself. So they framed their resistance as a protection of the water, and they saw it as a defense of the sacred. This was one of the largest gatherings of indigenous peoples in recent memory. And it enabled the voice and the sovereignty, again, the justice issues to come forward, braided or woven into the symbolic and religious understanding of these peoples. Along with the protection or resistance movement, there have been remarkable gatherings such as the Vatican inviting indigenous peoples for a discussion and an active apology on the part of the Pope, and the foregrounding of indigenous voices as these elders brought forth their understandings of their relationship with the world and their worldviews.
And the apology was for forced conversion and lack of appreciation for cultural knowledge. So finally, we want to just share a project that brings a lot of this together, and it transcends the particularity of world religions. It doesn't have God language and so on. This is Journey of the Universe, the epic story of cosmic, earth, and human transformation. And it's the story of evolution in a way that brings us into a sense of deep time, a 14 billion year unfolding universe of great complexity, of extraordinary understanding of developmental time. I mean, 10 billion years of universe evolution, 4.6, sorry, no, 10 billion years of universe evolution.
Prior to the Earth.
Prior to the Earth, which is 4.6 billion years. The numbers are staggering. But the point here is when we begin to grasp and feel our participation in this process, it has ecological reverberations for the future of life on the planet. So this is a project that is indebted to the new story of Thomas Berry. It was an Emmy Award-winning film. It's a book from Yale Press, from their science division. There's podcasts and interviews, earlier ones that I did with 20 individuals, 10 of them scientists, talking about the early universe and geology and biology, and then talking with environmentalists about how does this context matter for the energy to do this work. You know, frankly, a lot of people are giving up hope, or they feel disempowered or despair. And that's very widespread in North America, and I'm sure in Europe as well. So this is something that really activates awe, wonder, beauty for the action. And we've got 3 classes on Coursera. I want to mention Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit, French Jesuit and paleontologist, who is also an inspiration for this, because he saw evolution as the human story, that we're not zapped into this from the outside, but we emerge from starburst and supernova, where all the elements emerge and so on. So he was one of the original inspirations, along with Thomas Berry, for this work. So it's had a wide appeal, especially in the next generation, students and youth for whom formal religion doesn't really reverberate. We've been showing it in schools and universities, churches, retreat centers, and a whole curriculum's developed. We have next gen students working and showing it. Our last pre-COVID showing was in Beijing at the Yale Beijing Center, and 77,000 people watched it. We had Confucian scholars responding to it, as this is coherent with the cosmological understanding of Confucianism, that we are part of what they would call universe, earth, and human. So there's compatibility with the cosmologies of many of the world's religions. So the cosmic and earth's eco-spirituality suggests that there's an appreciation for the vast universe out of which earth and life evolved and to which we belong. This means from the very beginning, the great flaring forth 14 billion years ago, to the explosion of stars, supernovas, what we're seeing from the Webb telescope now, have had scientists weeping with the incredible, spectacular pictures. And here's one from central Pennsylvania, a friend took over a lake, and we see our own Milky Way galaxy, of which we're a part. A beautiful picture.
This evokes in us, obviously, a sense of reverence for this profound universe that we live in, respect for our most intimate contact with the earth itself, and increasingly a responsibility for the continuity of evolution as we understand it. This reverence, then, valuing the complexity of earth and ecological interdependence of all life systems, is not simply a pious disengagement from the world, but a reverence that brings us into even deeper contact with the world as it presents itself to us in these lunar eclipse moments, in the sense of every sunrise, every sunset, every moment of our waking life.
So respecting all life, realization that it is connected and emerged here on Earth after billions of years of evolution. This picture, some of you will remember, Earthrise, Christmas Eve, 1968, that it changed our consciousness when we saw this blue-green planet in the midst of the depths of time, of black space, and the livingness of this system. So the responsibility then for the future of life and the care and continuity of the living Earth community is what all of this work is about. Mountains, rainforests, rivers, fish and coral reefs, birds, humans, next generations.
Our effort has been to see that in all of the diversity of the religious traditions, they are all involved in an orienting to the larger cosmos.
And also grounding us in Earth's living systems.
I don't know of a single religious tradition that isn't concerned with food. It's evident that nurturing is a serious concern, nurturing to water, air, and food.
And finally, transforming us with energy for action. We're all looking for alternative energies that are going to make this great transition, as it's being called, possible, of physical energy. But we also need, as we know, a certain spiritual and psychic energy to do this work as well. And that's the offering of the world's religions as they are being retransformed for our time. It's the offering of spiritual insights of some of the world's religions like Unitarianism and so on, and nature-based understandings that are not God-based. And finally, it's also a scientifically based evolutionary story. All of these are emerging to inspire the awe and the action that we need in our times.
Thanks so much for this opportunity to lay out a few brief ideas with you.
We look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so lovely to watch that presentation, having read the book, and it brings me back to reading it and rereading it today as I was thinking about this conversation. I want to encourage everyone in the audience to not only post their questions, but also, I forgot to mention at the beginning, do turn on your videos, because it makes a big difference for Mary, Evelyn, and John to look out and see the people in the audience, but also for you to see each other. We have a question, Mary, Evelyn, and John, from Beth O'Connell, who basically asks about the doom and gloom and what values are needed to motivate change. And it touches on a question that I had, which is how you ended your book, Ecology and Religion, which is that during this lovely description of a trip that you took to Greenland, you posed the question, what gesture is possible in the face of such stupendous beauty and incredible loss? And I thought this tension between the stupendous beauty and incredible loss, it does kind of highlight the sadness, the really deep sadness, and then also, as you say, this awe and this wonder. So what for you are the actions, and how do we stay kind of active?
Well, I love that you referred to that beauty and loss, because that's what we're in the midst of. And there's no question that we have to be attentive to both. If we just focus on the loss, we're in the midst of a 6th extinction period where species are disappearing. But even at the Natural History Museum in New York, there's a plaque on the floor which says, this is the case, but we have the possibility of stemming the tide of destruction. And then in that exhibit, it shows destruction of ecosystems, deforestation, whatever, and then it shows restoration that is happening. And that's part of this dialectic, how we can stop some of the destruction, but how we can also move forward with restoration. And projects all over the world in the course on indigenous traditions and ecology, John interviewed traditional environmental leaders and practitioners, many of whom have science degrees as well, who are working on this type of restoration. It's quite extraordinary. So I want, of course, John, to speak to that, and I can say other things.
Well, I wanted to make an apology if I have been distracted for a bit, because the Juncos have just arrived. They seem to have begun their journey from the Arctic, and they're heading south, and they're feeding on some of the plants outside the windows here. And I think about their long journey, and do they enter into the doom and gloom of the journey? I don't know. I'm not a Junco. But I do know they undertake that journey, and they land on these branches to feed on the seeds, and they undertake that willing embrace of the journey. So also in that Sundance slide that presented the building of the lodge, dancers go in there and they undertake a significant fast. They deprive themselves so as to renew themselves, but also their bioregion. The Crow people are very intent on reestablishing that connection. So I sense that there's many areas, and many areas, especially of deep reflection for us as humans, regarding our own limits in order to see the flourishing of the earth.
And I think it's very clear, back to Beth's question, doom and gloom is only going to get us so far, because it really does take out the psychic energy from people. And that's part of the problem. People, give up. They don't feel anything is worth doing. But I want to just say, so facts are important, but facts are not the end. And facts and charts and measurements, which science gives us, again, are necessary, but not sufficient. And this is where Gus Speth, who headed up UN Development Program, he founded World Resources Institute, he founded the Natural Resources Defense Council, the legal arm here in the US and around the world now of environmental protection. He is a tremendous lawyer. He does give a lot of gloom and doom, but he really feels the other ways of knowing, including the arts, including culture, including ethics, are absolutely necessary. And that's why he brought us to Yale 17 years ago. And I would say what's exceedingly inspiring to us are the students at Yale and elsewhere that we're in touch with. They're very bright next-gen students, and they're not giving up. They struggle, definitely. The mental health issues all across our country and elsewhere are severe, but they have creativity. They have amazing ideas. We spent an hour yesterday with someone applying to PhD programs, and he is very pumped up for trying to make a difference. And so we like to say, I'll conclude with this, we give an intergenerational handshake to say, yes, we are at the most critical moment in human history, but with the next generation, we can make a difference. And for whatever reason, that lights them up. We've got to encourage the next generation in their creativity.
Provide the inspiration for the perspiration.
Great. Okay, we have another question. I have so many of my own questions, but I want to give hold space for people who have joined from all over the world. So we have people from France. We have John from Issy, Ida from Nogent-sur-Marne, Robin from Bouillon-Billancourt. We have somebody from Florida. So welcome all. John asks, it seems from a Christian perspective that these ideas of ecological connectiveness are being rediscovered, or at least re-emphasized in other religions. Are these ideas seeing a resurgence, or are they more de-emphasized in modern times?
Yeah.
So they're not being de-emphasized. I might have missed the question. These ideas are being recovered in the present, so that now, much to our surprise, as John just said, there's 17 graduate programs, which are master's programs, 3 PhD programs, some at seminaries, some in departments of religion all across the country, which is truly fantastic, because there was no field of religion and ecology 25 years ago. But the retrieval of ideas within these traditions, the reevaluation of their relevance to the problems we're facing, including climate change, including biodiversity loss, pollution, and so on, is what's happening with scholars, with theologians, scriptural scholars, et cetera, of all the world's religions, and then a new reconstruction of them. I could speak about this for a long time, about Confucianism. I'll be on a Zoom with Confucian scholars at the end of the month, where they have been talking for the last several years about an ecological civilization in China, drawing on the traditions of Confucianism, which are remarkably rich, not well known in the West at all. Buddhism is much better known, but so these traditions are being brought forward by literally thousands of people. This is just something we have midwifed, but so many people are doing this work, and even more creative. I wish I could give you lots of examples, but it is happening. We need things to happen maybe even quicker, but it's an exciting moment.
In the academic field of the study of religion, these questions about the distancing from the surrounding world, from the natural world, the distancing of the human, has been a topic of much discussion. One approach which is resurfaced as interest is the thought of Karl Jaspers and his focus on what he calls the axial religions, or the emergence of the major traditions during a period of increasing focus on the transcendence of the sacred, or the idea of a God in the sky, or of a distant enlightenment encounter. So that we find residues of this, of course, in the Abrahamic traditions, orienting themselves to a paradisial afterlife, or in the South Asian traditions towards some enlightenment beyond, or gone far away from this world. We know also the industrial technological age has further distanced the human, and the religious traditions oriented themselves, were literally shaped by these worldviews as they emerged in the industrial period. And now our technological distancing by virtue of the digital age. So the reflections within the academic field are now matched by our awareness of this toxicity that we have imposed upon the world, the toxicity of soils and waters and air, as well as the profound realization of biodiversity loss, let alone our trying to come to grips with the change of climate and these broad issues related to climate change that we're now calling the polycrisis, the environmental polycrisis. So religions are reflecting upon this. Our effort in this project has been to bring forward what we see as the moments of intimacy between human communities and the larger Earth systems, and to bring them forward. It is not as if religions have carried them forward with full reflective understandings. Much has been lost, but much can be recovered.
And it's why we use the word eco-spirituality, because we're trying to say, I'm sure everyone on this webinar loves a hike in the mountains, loves to ski, loves to go to the Mediterranean and have the sea and the air and the clear sky blow over them. And, you know, we're constantly renewed and refreshed by nature when we have that chance. And so it's a sense to say this is a very ancient sensibility, way beyond the religions, which are, you know, at most 5,000, 6,000 years old. So once we recover that, it actually opens up a space of renewal. And this is what's almost astonishing to us, because it's so natural to us. And that sensibility, especially with the next generation, is vibrant, because the eco-anxiety that they're suffering from needs an antidote, so they don't go into a black hole of despair, alienation, addictions, and all the other things that are out there.
Okay, I want to jump on your use of our words that begin with R, and also your use of this idea of transcendence, because you mentioned many of the kind of common values that you cite in your book about the common values that world religions hold in relation to the natural world. So you talked about reverence, respect, restoration, responsibility, reciprocity. Certainly, I want to ask you about two maybe less popular ones in the United States, this idea of restraint and redistribution. Out of all of these R words, which for you are kind of the most important and possibly the most challenging values that we really need for the 21st century?
You're right that especially in the United States, restraint and redistribution is hugely problematic. But one of the great economists, Herman Daly, just passed away, and there was an extraordinary webinar for him. He was talking about steady state development. Limits to Growth, of course, is one of the books that sold so many copies. And this notion of restraint, of limits, in Europe, a precautionary principle. We have a lot to learn for Europeans. It's always been encouraging to me to come to conferences there because that thinking is so much more developed, especially in the Nordic countries, but across Europe, really. And redistribution, the self-centeredness of a society like the US that highlights individualism, human liberties, is unfortunately so distorted that the so-called American dream, which is materialism more and more, that's part of the critique of Laudato Si, is creating illness, literally. So materialism that matter doesn't matter except to me, my family, etc., needs to be completely reconfigured. And it's why some of the communitarian traditions of East Asia, like Confucianism, have had a huge appeal to me. It's not that one or the other is correct. We need the freedoms that the Enlightenment period has brought, but we also need a sense of the common good. And that has disappeared, unfortunately, in the US. Anyway,
I find in the discussions with students at Yale and in other settings where we give talks, that the two R's that surface in my mind in those discussions so immediately is responsibility and reciprocity. And just to cut to the chase, the reason those terms provide such a core setting is that it's mutual. It's the givingness of the earth as well as the human understanding what our responsibility and what our reciprocity is. But it's not simply one way. It's a constant give and take of the world and the human in which we are embedded. And students realize this and are searching for communities that shape themselves. And Indigenous communities provide very interesting, profound examples of these life ways in which the braidedness of these understandings is woven into their economics, their governance, the way they undertake life.
Okay, I want to go to Rosemarie's question, but John, I want to just ask you to explain a little bit more. When you use this word lifeway, you used it earlier. I was so struck by it in your book. You write, lifeway refers to a traditional integrated style of life found among many Indigenous peoples that distinguishes them from modern secular societies that tend to make distinctions between economics and ecology, politics and society, science and religion. You write that there's a seamlessness between these sectors in Indigenous peoples. Can you kind of expound upon this? Because it's as you say, it's a kind of braidedness of all of these more disparate parts of a Western view of the world.
When I first engaged in field studies, and let me use the word studies with some emphasis, like a good social scientist, I went to objectify and to keep the distance, but Indigenous elders were constantly opening the door. Come in. What do you see? What are you aware of? What does your mind engage here? And they brought me in my study of religion, gradually doubling back on myself, to be very dissatisfied with the term religion as an adequate term to describe what I was seeing among the people that I was visiting, namely a ritual life in which the children were running around in the ceremonial and laughter filled the air, while the elders were still very carefully focused on building the community towards good mind, towards a collective understanding of what they were engaged in, what they were trying to accomplish. And so the effort of focusing the community in this sense of a healing activity or of a social welfare activity, that this was braided. It was not simply a separate activity, religion on Sunday, so to speak, or an activity that was for a special group. It involved the whole community in their own understandings. I found the term lifeway in the anthropological literature, and it became for me a way of transcending but bridging to the communities that I was studying and acknowledging that their meaningful engagement with the world was not simply, it's not something separate from their day-to-day activity, but woven into it.
If I can piggyback very quickly, because I see a hand raised and so on, is the same applies to the East Asian religions. The whole term religion is very much Western constructed, very much God in the sky, very much salvation outside this world, and so on, escapism, if you will. That's a caricature, of course, of Western religions, but the term just doesn't apply. There's been so many discussions, arguments, books about what is religious about Confucianism that's different. So just wanted to put that in. Lifeway is terrific also for the Asian religions.
Great. Okay, I want to go back to Rosemarie's question because I think it just digs more deeply into this idea of consumerism. So she writes, in the US last month, I heard this from a religious relative about the energy transition. We hear a lot about this in Europe. Do we want to reduce our standard of living? I'm perplexed about how to respond to this. It seems that religion is bumping up against materialism and consumerism. So we talked about that kind of tension, but can you talk about specifically why some people are framing the energy transition as in tension with our standard of living, and how possibly religion makes us think about how we can reframe what it means to have a good standard of living?
I'd like to think of two responses. Mary Evelyn earlier spoke of human energies in relationship to the whole energy project for our activities. I think that's one area we need to think seriously about too. What is it that how do we energize ourselves as human? And then second, I'm struck by my own aging process, what it means now to consider what I need, what I want at this age. And it changes in a person's life. I think societies change in their understanding of their needs and wants. And just finally, I think the American dream of unlimited consumption, we're up against that kind of unfettered dream as something that's no longer realistic.
Yeah, a certain madman, I won't name his name, represents that unfettered American dream. And that's what's so curious and horrendous, that still has some kind of appeal, to live in luxury instead of to live with a sense that 8 billion people, we will have no future without a shared future. And that is a job of the world's religions, to reconfigure what the common good means, what limits mean. You know, we did this, all of us, Europeans and Americans, during World War II. There were victory gardens. There was all kinds of massive recycling and a sense of common purpose. My grandfather was ambassador to Spain in the Second World War, and he was trying to keep Spain neutral so we could land in North Africa and so on. That sense was huge in American consciousness once they got out of their isolationism. So we can do this if it is presented in a way that is efficacious. And finally, George Bush the first went to Rio to say, the Rio Earth Summit in '92, to say, we're not giving up our standard of living. So this is very old, rather awful, and needs to be rethought. How does this play with Africa, Latin America, Asia? We have traveled widely in the world, and this notion of our standard of living is just unacceptable.
Mary Evelyn, just briefly, you mentioned population. Don't many of the religions want unlimited population?
Well, some certainly, especially Catholicism and Islam, but not all the world's religions have any problem with population control. It's a huge and important question, but I'm interested in what Peter might be thinking about.
Yes, let's go to Peter. Okay, Peter, I'm gonna get you to unmute yourself if you can. Great.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that thank you for alluding a couple of times to Unitarianism, because besides Beth, there are several of us that are part of the Paris Fellowship of the Unitarian Universalists. And we got together recently, some of us, and had a talk about some of the ideas that you've been talking about, in particular, the importance of the interdependence. And we were defining, with nature, we were defining exactly how far that went. And we came to an interesting point of discussion. And I think that many times all of us, including yourselves, tend to have gotten a bit sloppy in our thinking about this. And I was just wondering how you would react, because a lot of people seem to say that the limit of this is some kind of life, as you put it, sentience maybe, and then there's lots of debates about which beings are sentient and which aren't, and things like that. But perhaps the earlier question that was put on the chat about the telescope in Hawaii points to the fact that maybe even things that are not considered living are also relevant to this discussion. Rocks, if you want to talk about it in the most mundane fashion. And I think the John's allusion to the indigenous traditions really points us in that direction, that we maybe shouldn't say it's only birds and mammals and whatever,
Totally.
even in plants and things like that, but even things that we don't conceive it yet as being, living, might be relevant to the importance of these discussions.
No question. That's why I mentioned chi, because chi is from the very beginning. This is why everybody loves rocks, stones, minerals, and so on. It's a manifestation of incredible complexity and beauty. So there's no question. I begin that slide part with mountains. So you're absolutely right. To me, that's the continuity of being that Due Ming, a great Confucian scholar, speaks about. So yes, 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 and it's not just indigenous, it's far into the East Asian traditions as well.
It's a powerful meditation, as I think of it, to reflect upon the molten earth in this seemingly shifting shape that molten lava would give forth not only landscapes, but organic life, and you and I, this consciousness, and just to reflect on how can we make the barrier from organic, inorganic so solid and clear and differentiating when we come out of that molten earth.
See, the Western traditions are in a minority in making that distinction between life and so-called non-life. And that's where we have to realize the world's thought patterns, life ways have something to offer here as a course corrective. But I see that,
question.
Yeah, it's so good, Peter. Thank you.
And I want to, Peter, that was fantastic, because it also points us back to the question that I didn't get to, I realized. So this is from JC Sutcliffe. This will be our last question in the interest of time. JC Sutcliffe asks, it's a kind of, let's say, an ethical case study. How can we reconcile this? They ask. $1.1 billion for a 30-meter telescope planned for Mauna Kea, in opposition, I imagine, to Hawaii, who's stymied by native Hawaiians who claim that the site is sacred. The telescope is an eye into God's creation, so why oppose it?
It's a great question.
Well, I have no definitive response that would be a solution to such a provocative question, but I'm reminded in the Taoist tradition, in that text we call the Tao Te Ching, the emphasis in one of the verses to know the bright, know the rational, know this kind of scientific understanding. So the telescope is, to me, represents that kind of emphasis, know the bright, but the text says, hold to the dark. And that dark is not the Abrahamic and the Persian sense of good and evil, or the dark as evil, but dark as the profoundly nurturing unknown. And I think we are moved now in these times of uncertainty and of quantum reflection, that the dark begins to hold a path for our understanding, that we will be guided by our uncertainty as we step out. We don't know where we will step sometimes, but we come to an understanding that Indigenous people say, wherever we step on Mother Earth, and she always lifts us up.
And the Mauna Kea case has been very, very controversial for many years, with protests from Hawaiian people, and then the science researchers saying we need and desire this understanding. So it's one of the conflicts of our time, right? It's not resolvable. It's not an either or. This is right, that is wrong. But how do we see things in a more yin-yang, light and dark, as John has just said, manner? And I want to, so that's, I would not come out in any way definitively about the Mauna Kea case, but I wanted to say something else after John does.
Okay, I wanted to raise the justice issue. I've had occasion to speak with astronomers and those who are building the telescopes, and they've raised this question to me about the ambiguity of Indigenous resistance they resented at times. And I say to them, well, let's consider this. Would you consider giving to the Indigenous communities that are protesting? Would you allow their children to come to the telescope and to learn what it is that you are so fascinated by? Would you give them time? You can see immediately they resisted it. It's such valuable time. Of course, we would not give it to the local people. To me, that's the crux of the issue. Shared understanding with communities, justice issues.
Yeah, we spent several years, 3 years, on the peoples of the Pacific at the University of Hawaii, and the Indigenous peoples and their knowledge base, especially, of course, the peoples of Hawaii. And we've been to the Big Island, we've been to Mauna Kea, we've been to ceremonies and so on Hawaii, which the Big Island is the example of what we're coming back to: an erupting volcano, a living earth community, which peoples there have held as sacred for centuries. We could go into the recovery of navigational techniques of the Hawaiian peoples in the Hokulea voyages across the Pacific, astonishing revival of ways of knowing. And I want to just touch back to Peter's question, because it's so good, it's so important. And, you know, the mineral nature, we see it in the volcanoes, right? The living flow of lava. But the mineral exhibit at the Natural History Museum in New York, and recently when we were in Pittsburgh, has been totally redone, these rooms. People are flocking to these rooms because they see, they sense the crystal structures, the incredible complexity of the geological formations of Earth. And that is part of this restoration of a moment where we can say we're part of a living Earth community that's dynamic, changing. And that's what we have to align ourselves in this new energy of solar, of wind, of geothermal. How do we align ourselves with that kind of energy, physical and spiritual?
Okay, may I just ask you one more question?
Sure.
Okay, because you mentioned very early on in your presentation, Mary Evelyn, that you were kind of when you were traveling in Japan a long time ago, several decades ago, you were anticipating these changes, and we saw the books you've written over the years, and even the covers of the books, some of these early books, just show you for how long you've been thinking about these topics. And that's what so struck me when I discovered your work in the spring, is that, I mean, the foresight of your research and of your study. I mean, do you feel like you've been having this conversation, and now finally the kind of mainstream consciousness is joining you? How do you, and what do you predict will be the next steps, given that you've been so prescient so far?
Well, prescience maybe, but it's all a gift. It comes I mean, I think the universe, honestly, is moving this forward. We're just midwifing, and we're with incredible communities of people all over the world who do get it, as I sense this wonderful group does. I'm so happy to be with you this evening and so on, because so that sensibility, Margaret Mead used to say, all it takes is a small group of people to change the consciousness. And that is definitely happening. There's no question. So this birthing process that many have been involved in, your Unitarian group and others, is definitely growing apace. And that's incredibly encouraging because the next generation gets it. There's no silos in their mind between science and values, ecology and ethics. Spirituality is infused in these processes. So that's really exciting, I think. And I really hope you'll continue your great work at the library, but in all your communities, Unitarian and otherwise.
Hear, hear.